Welcome to The Truth in This Art. I am your host, Rob Lee. This is your source for candid conversations on arts and culture. Today, I'm speaking with a guest who's a natural storyteller. And for the past 14 years, he's gotten to tell the story of the Strong National Museum of Play in Rochester, New York, home of the largest collection of toys, dolls, games, and video games in the world. He holds a bachelor's degree in history and a master's degree in journalism. He's the senior director of public relations at the Strong. Let's call it the Strong. Please welcome Shane Rhinewald. Welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me on. Glad to be talking to you today, Rob.
Likewise. Happy to start this off. And I think this is going to be fun. And I'm looking forward to it, as I was sharing a little bit before we got started. So I think starting off, I like to, really do that introductory sort of questions before we get too deep in it. And I gave literally the kind of cut and paste bio, but if you will, could you share like your story? Could you share your story? And I got a few bullet points under there and sub bullet points, but I want to at least open it up for that. So if you could share your story, please.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love that word story because for me, that's sort of been the thread, the theme throughout my entire life. So I've always been a storyteller. Ever since I was the littlest of kids, I had stories about dragons and knights sort of pouring out of my head, that creative energy. In third grade, I tried to write the next great fantasy novel. Did not work out for me, not a famous author, but that always carried through. And I was also a big fan of history, sort of that story of us as people. How did we get to where we are today? Both what are the triumphs of humanity? What are the many, many terrible mistakes we've made along the way? But how have we as people arrived at this point? And so that really led me to the history degree that you mentioned earlier, undergrad. And then I went into journalism because that then became the way for me to tell a story about people. And of course, that's always a natural segue into public relations. And I think public relations sometimes has that sort of corporate, sterile association. People think of it as, okay, you're a spokesperson for this big company and you say, buy more toothpaste. That's important. Yeah. But when you work at a museum like the Strong National Museum of Play, that's all about how play reflects our culture. What are the things that we all love that sort of have this universal appeal? Who are the people that made these things? What are some of the stories that have gotten brushed to the side that we can now tell about the people that have created these things and influenced our lives? So that idea of a storyteller that we've been talking about, it's kind of come full circle. And now that's my job at the museum is what are the new collections items? What are the amazing artifacts that people don't know that we have and the people behind them? What are the exhibits? Why is play itself important?
Right. That's great. It's great to be able to have that as a mission. I would imagine it's fun. And I have some questions related to that later, but I want to step back a little bit and ask about, like, for you growing up, what sticks out for you in terms of play? Where you mentioned like storytelling and that is a piece, and I kind of relate to that as well. But also, what sorts of play were you engaged in? Was it video games? Was it toys? And if so, which ones?
So I was a big outdoor play. I loved kind of free roaming. I don't know. I think things maybe have changed as far as parenting. I'm the parent of a 3-year-old now, and I don't want to be that helicopter parent, but I'm a little bit of that. Ooh, don't go near the road. Don't do this. But I remember back in my days, late 80s, early 90s, kind of hopping on a bike with a group of friends and heading out across the neighborhood, going up into the woods behind our house and playing. And there was a role-playing element to that, too. We loved to, build forts and pretend that we were defending a castle against the enemy and things like that. So that was always a big part of it. And I was a gamer growing up as well. I have a lot of fond memories of the Nintendo systems, the Super NES and the 64, and playing those. And kind of as those consoles evolved, I lost track of that a little bit, kind of post-college and with the professional career, but definitely in my teen and even early 20 years, gaming was a big part of what I did. And that's another story that we tell at the museum because it's had such a huge impact on the way that people play for the last, 40 plus years.
So in your role, in sort of this public relations and media relations and storytelling, on average, and this may be, more complicated than I would hope, but what does a typical day look like for you? And maybe the answer is there are no typical days.
Yeah, you probably get that a lot, right?
Yeah.
So there are a lot of ebbs and flows, and it does depend on what the stories are, what's happening. So I get to be very responsive to the other teams at the museum. I am their service center. So if our collections team says, we just acquired this amazing collection from this trailblazer in the video game industry, we want to announce that, then I get to jump on that project. And how do we tell this story? What are the interesting snippets? What's the bigger kind of tale?
Yeah.
Just as an example of what a crazy day for me can look like. So a few days ago, we announced our National Toy Hall of Fame finalists. So that's a big program that we have at the museum. It just lets us talk broadly to a national, international audience about why are toys important? What are the best toys of all time? What makes a toy good? What are those toys that sort of bring us all together, that we all have multi-generations of people that have played with? So we announced that and had huge fanfare, and working with CNN to get them materials and the Today Show. And so that for me is sort of a big, busy but fun day. They're not all like that, but
so was there, and having and I think you touched on it a little bit. So if you have, I hope you don't mind kind of restating or adding a little extra depth to it. Was there any like life experiences, and I would imagine growing up, it impacts it, but are there any life experiences that help shape your creative sensibility, having these sorts of interests in storytelling, having this sort of interest in play overall, or having even an interest in like history and journalism? Because in describing it, I can see those kind of intersections and those kind of like how they point together, but tell me about that.
So for me, I have this really distinct memory when I was little. I mean, I was preschool age, maybe 4-ish, a little under, where I was sitting at the kitchen table with my mother, and I had all of these stories about dragons and knights and different things that were sort of pouring out of my head, but I didn't know how to write them down. And I could do the illustrations. I wanted to draw all of the pieces. But I remember my mom sitting there, and this was, several nights, and she would write them down, and then I would illustrate after, and then we would put the yarn in, and at the end of it, I would have my own book that I had created. And I remember being just so proud of that. And now as a parent of a 3-year-old, I look back and go, that's a lot to sit there and have somebody dictate a story to you, and to just write it down and have that sort of patience. And I always look at that as a moment where that could have gone the other way. She could have been too busy. My hand is cramping. I don't want to sit here and write for 2 straight hours. And I can imagine sort of like how that might have dampened that spirit, but instead it sort of ballooned from that point forward.
Yeah, it's like, hey, scribe, I need you.
You're right. Please get your pen and ink out and
take a note, scribe. Yes, your lord.
Yeah.
So, what sorts of tools do you utilize in sort of this marketing and storytelling that have been really effective for promoting like exhibitions or getting the word out and the message out around exhibitions and bringing basically awareness to specific exhibitions, but awareness to the museum overall?
Sure. So the museum does have a bigger marketing team that does paid advertising and all of that good stuff. But what I've really enjoyed doing more lately is not necessarily that long form storytelling, the press releases and here's all of the information, but those short snippet stories that you could tell, whether that's through video on social media, but those little small bites that make it piques their interest. Oh, I didn't know about that person. I didn't know that they had invented that. I didn't know the story of that. And, now I can learn more about that, plus additional things at this exhibit or at the museum. And that's definitely been super effective. And it's also changed sort of my view of how to tell a good story. Because from the beginning, it was writing. Like, I love short stories and novels. I was telling you about, trying to write a novel in 3rd grade that didn't pan out so well. but a story doesn't have to be long form. A story can be told in 15 seconds if you do it effectively. If you have a hook, if you have an interesting character, if you have a factoid that it's gonna resonate with people.
Yeah, it's a show that I watch. I think it's called Two Sentence Horror Stories, and it's kind of that. And even changing, because that's one of the things that I'm really interested in, kind of changing how we view all of it, like blow it all up and let's really revise it. So, I've had this podcast described as anthropology by some people, or storytelling and kind of in documentary and all these different things. And I had to think about it as more than a podcast. There's some attention there, and there is an effectiveness there and a certain angle that, and I think what you were describing a moment ago that really resonates with me is, I bet you guys didn't know this, the did you knows. And that's really what interests me, because I try to go into every conversation, and I position myself, and I think of myself as a facilitator for storytelling. Like, you guys are, as the guests are coming on telling the story, I'm just kind of molding it in a certain way, curating it in a certain way. But being able to do that sort of did you know thing and coming into every conversation with a fair amount of like intellectual curiosity, that's what kind of makes, I think, the conversations interesting and rich. Yeah,
and I love the idea of what you're doing. And now I have ideas kicking around in my head about maybe we should have some kind of podcast about the Play podcast.
Look, I mean, I might know a podcast. I might know a guy. So what would you say are, and I might modify this question a little bit, but what would you say are the key elements of great storytelling? And I know effectiveness is one, and that is probably like up there. Like, have you thought this through? Kind of. But what are the key elements of great storytelling, and what would you say your number one storytelling tip is?
So for me, I always look for the people, the interesting people that have sort of moved and shaped, in the case of the museum, the world of play, the world of toys, the world of video games, and something that's becoming increasingly important in the museum world. And I think we all across the museum world need to do better at it, continue to do better at it, is to tell the stories of the people that, the stories got pushed to the side for whatever reason throughout history, the lesser known stories.
Sure.
Which could be everything from, in the video game industry, not just telling the story of the biggest players in the industry, but the smallest players in the industry as well. Everybody knows Nintendo and Sony and Microsoft, but who are the other ones? But it's also the individuals who, may have gotten marginalized or pushed to the edges for whatever reason. We have at the museum a really interesting exhibit on women in the video game industry as an example, because it's often thought of as a very male-driven domain. Certainly in the early industry, not a lot of representation across all groups as far as who was making games, who was designing games, who was creating games. But there were so many stories in there that people don't know of, women in the industry that were designers that created games that, we would tell the story and people go, oh, I didn't know that she made that game. I played that in the late 70s and it was my favorite arcade game. So not that I take credit, like we get to tell the story that no one else is telling, like certainly others are, but to be a part of that is gratifying, to have somebody say, oh, I didn't know that. I hadn't heard of, but she changed the industry, or this person changed the industry.
It's important to have some of those things sort of baked in, like, and again, that's why I think with how I describe what I'm doing is facilitating that. It's just like, this is the version of the interview that I want to do, you know what I mean? Or the version of the story that I want to come out. And I always joke with people. It's like, if you want to get on here and talk about He-Man for an hour, we can talk about He-Man for an hour, go Battle Cat and Orko. And I would imagine there is a fair amount of interest in those kind of like, let's get to the other level. What was the thinking that went into some of these things that we love? Like, what comes to mind for me is the toys that made us, and those different documentaries around like cartoons, or even the video game documentary that was on Netflix.
Yeah, that showcase how and that's something that we as a museum love to collect. So we have the objects, the Masters of the Universe toys and toys from the 80s and going back. But when we can get our hands on the archival documents, the personal notebooks of the people that created it, the prototypes, and we can tell that story of how that came about, sort of the creative, inventive energy behind it. And sometimes it's that great creative story of somebody had an idea. Ralph Baer's an example, credited with creating the first home console video game system. And just an amazing story of somebody whose family fled Nazi Germany. He came to America. He was working in I believe the defense industry for a while. And then he was on I always forget if it was a bus or a train, but he was just riding along on his way home. And the idea of, what if we connected a video game to our TV and we could play it in our own house? Like the fact that nobody had thought of that prior, and now it's just so universal. Oh yeah, you can play a game. Like, it's just such an amazing creative story. And then there are the ones that are, the stories of how something came about, and it was somebody had an idea and somebody stole the idea and somebody sued somebody, and they're sort of less of that American dream creative spark of genius moment and more of the, okay, well, that's unfortunate, but that's a part of the history of it too.
Yeah, I one thing that always sticks out is the Masters of the Universe story, or even the Transformers story. I was like, oh, this was just to sell more toys, or this cartoon, or what have you, or I don't care if it's to scale. Put a saddle on that tiger, or what have you. This is what we're doing,
right?
And just
a
hearing
vehicle for advertising.
Yeah, and just hearing the story that goes along with some of these things. It is enthralling. It's like I could do a whole season with like the one dude that was responsible for making even something like the movie ones, right? Like even something like the guy that made the T-Rex walk in the first like Jurassic Park. I could watch him for like a 4-episode arc. So that kind of sort of minutia of these are the things that I love and how can I learn more and do a more comprehensive sort of deep dive in it. Those are the things that really interest me.
How it came about, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's the great thing about the museum. Even for me, like there's just so much nostalgia in these toys, and I have a personal interest in knowing these stories too. So then to get to figure out how to encapsulate that story and tell it to other people is kind of a dream come true.
Yeah, I did a movie review of this is so stupid, but I did a movie review of the first 2 Ninja Turtles movies from the 90s, and I have some of the old figures like in my creative like altar area. So I'm doing terribly dubbed voices, and it's like 2 Leonardos talking to each other. One is a pop, one is an action figure. And it's like, hey, Leonardo, what Leonardo? Are you going to listen to this new episode of? I was like, this is terrible. But it was like me going back into play. So, which is a segue. It's a haphazard segue, but a segue nonetheless. So despite working at the Strong, it isn't just all play. Obviously there's work getting done. So how do you make work feel like play? Like, I'm very interested in that kind of juxtaposition. Like, you're in a place that has play in the title, but you're working at a place. So how do
but
you?
I don't get to play arcade machines all day and drop tokens into the pinball machines. Well, I think it's sort of the higher level about the museum. So we are, as a museum, super interactive, and you can't be a museum about play without letting families come and play and run around. But we do sort of underneath that all have really serious academic underpinnings. So we publish a peer-reviewed journal about play that talks about what is play, why is play important. We have the collections items that we interpret and we tell those stories. So you can look at the first handmade prototype Monopoly set, and then you can go and play a version of, many of your favorite board games that are oversized. So that's the interesting thing about what we do is we do bring work and seriousness to a subject that's fun and whimsical. Yeah. And then day to day for me, there's paperwork. There are certainly things like in any job where I don't necessarily want to be doing this right now. It's not the most exciting part about my day. But the nice thing is that there are those moments where, I'm working with media on a story and we're sort of in the depths of the museum in the vault and we're shining the spotlight on some really cool artifact. And those are the moments where, okay, this is actually fun and playful and work can be play.
That's fantastic. So I got two more real questions, and then I got a few rapid fire questions for you. So before we get to the rapid fire ones, let's get let's get the vegetables out of the way before we get to the dessert. Let's put it that way. So how does the museum source its collections and its exhibits and all of that stuff? How does the sourcing go?
Yeah, so we're interesting as far as a collecting museum. Lots of museums collect things that there may not be that many of. They may be so old that there are only certain ways to source them. If you're an art museum and you're looking for art from ancient China, there's only so many places that's sort of floating around and so many auction houses that have that. But we're in the business of toys, both older toys, but toys that are being made today. So there's a little bit of that element of constantly collecting, figuring out what's being brought to market today that in 100 years might be important to a scholar or relevant or tell us something about our culture. So we have to be very forward thinking on that. But as far as where we get things, if it's something that we just need an example of that's kind of everyday and there's a million in the world, that might come from eBay or someplace online. If it's something that there's only one of, then we may acquire that from the person that has it. Sometimes things will go up for auction. Like we did acquire the only prototype Monopoly set in the entire world that was in the Steve Forbes personal collection and went up for auction. So that was one of those moments of, okay, Monopoly is hugely important. It's a board game that everyone recognizes. It's sort of a part of American culture and fabric and tells us a fairly interesting story about capitalism as well.
Yeah. Capitalism is fun.
Yeah. Bankrupt all of your friends. Even though the story from that is that it was based on a game that was the opposite, that was supposed to be about the sort of the ills of the people, the renting and landlords and them making the money and pressuring everybody else. So it was supposed to teach people that this is not good. And then it somehow morphed in the Great Depression into, well, you don't have money now, but wouldn't it be fun to bankrupt your friends because you're in your personal life, you are struggling. So again, back to the interesting stories.
Way to do a rebrand, right?
Yeah.
So this is the last one, and I think I got a good sense on some of the skills that you're using in your work. So, are there any ones that you feel like you want to highlight? Feel free to. So, as a public relations like manager, director of public relations for the museum, which skills do you rely on most, and which skills are you still developing, and which part of your job surprises you?
Yeah, I think what surprised me, well, not necessarily surprised me, but what was different from what I was used to. So from the storytelling background that we've been talking about in journalism, the writing side of things, the talking to people kind of one-to-one and offline, I had down. But when you jump into a role like this, you have to sometimes jump in front of a camera, sometimes jump on Zoom like this and have a conversation. And that was something that I had not had a lot of experience with. That, there was a little bit in the back of my mind. Sometimes the writing process is pretty introverted. You don't have to talk to people. You can turn the lights off in your office and type away. But how do I take that storytelling and do it sort of in a verbal way? And that for me, when I made the transition from journalism to PR, was something that was new. And I think I've hopefully developed those skills over the last 14 years, but it's one that's definitely always a work in progress, because there's still that little part in the back of my head that was the introverted writer that's like, wait, are we talking right now? What are is everything coming out of your mouth okay? You could have probably written this so much better.
I have that on occasion too, and doing I've been podcasting for 13 years, almost 14, and when I do more kind of public facing things, I'm like, oh, right, I'm in front of people, so I should.
You're like, now they're looking at me.
Yeah. And the thing is, like, people are really surprised when they see me in person because I'm 6'4", so it's like I can't hide either. It's like, just is there a huge Monopoly like metal dog that I can hide behind? That would be great.
Yeah, yeah. The podium's not going to help you if you're presenting in front of.
So those are actually the real questions. So if you're ready to rock and roll on these rapid fire questions, we can do it.
All right, I'm ready. This is the part where that old introverted writer part of my brain is like, uh-oh, rapid fire.
Yeah. So as I always tell people, don't overthink it, don't overthink it, overthink it. Yeah, brevity is key here. What do you collect in your own personal life?
Whiskey. Is that okay to say on here?
Nice. Any particular kind?
I like scotch because my wife and I, we went on our honeymoon and we've been back a few times. I have some heritage, Scottish heritage in the family. And I don't know, just connected with it. So, and I should put out there, these aren't like the multi-$100 bottles. They're the more of the entry level, but
I dig it. I
have them on hand.
I'm a Scotch guy as well. So shout out to you.
Great. All right. See?
Yeah.
And I have a lot of books too. I mean, that goes hand in hand with.
I have a lot of DVDs.
Okay.
Yeah. It's a lot of like just dead tech. But it's something about the tones, man. It's a warmer feel when you have something in your hand.
It's nice to have something, not just my streaming library or a catalog.
Yeah. Lord of the Rings, Game of Thrones, or Stranger Things. If there was only one that you could watch the rest of your days, which one would it be?
Oh, wow.
I know.
So I should say I watch all of them and love all of them. And I haven't started House of Dragon, the spinoff of Game of Thrones, but I've started the other Lord of the Rings Amazon series.
I know.
I might go Stranger Things right now, though. It's just the 80s nostalgia is such a
child of the 80s. It's just right there. It's just like, and it kind of leans into some of all of the other things that are there. Like the fantasy elements are there. Some of the gaming stuff. It's just like, I could actually have been one of those kids.
Yeah. I think that's when you can put yourself in those shoes. You're like, okay, I'm on my bike and I'm, going through the neighborhood on my way to fight some demonic.
I think I'm actually the Demogorgon, though. I think that's actually what's happening. I don't know. On the mind flayer is fine.
At least you admit it, right? You know your role.
I own it. Describe the biggest perk of your job, of either working where you're at or what your role is. But what is the biggest perk of doing what you do?
I think it's meeting all sorts of amazing people, both in terms of people in the media and in the industry. I've had the privilege of meeting designers and inventors and folks that have sort of changed and shaped the course of play. And then just every day, getting to work across all the teams of the museum, not just kind of sitting in the silo and doing one thing, but saying, hey, what do you guys have that's new? What do you have that's new? What can we talk about?
Yeah.
And sort of getting it right from the experts and the sources.
It's pretty crisp. Here's the last one. I wanted to save this one because I think it really ties everything and it would lead into some of the shameless plugs I like to wrap up on. But if a person only has 1 hour to spend at the museum at this current stage, what would you recommend that they check out? What would you recommend that they see? They have 1 hour. That's just a tight hour.
That's a tight hour.
59 minutes, 59 seconds. What would you recommend?
If it's an adult visitor or an adult group that, isn't necessarily going to want to play as a family, we actually have a tour called our 12 Must-See Artifact Tour that takes about an hour, kind of an audio tour that takes you through the 12 things that once you walk out the door, you can say, wow, I can't believe I saw X, Y, and Z. And that has on it that first prototype Monopoly set we were talking about. It has on it some of the earliest video game systems. We have one of the first handmade jigsaw puzzles from the late 1700s. So the kind of things that you would say, I couldn't see that anywhere else. I'm glad I got to see that. If you go to the Louvre, you want to see the Mona Lisa. If you go to here, you want to see this. Well, for us, we don't have those things, but you can see the first Monopoly set. You can see. So I would recommend picking that tour up and moving quickly. It's a big space.
No, I appreciate that. I think, really trying to capitalize and not to monopolize on your time. I realize how corny that sounded at the end. When you're trying to capitalize,
it was perfect.
When you're trying to capitalize on making the most of your time, I think having a few places that are like, these are the showstoppers. Everything is great here, but this is definitely for that first introductory trip. You got to go, you got to check this out, and then you're going to get drawn back in. Plan your next 2 trips, but that first one, you definitely have to see this.
Then come back and bring the full family and spend half a day or a full day.
Yeah.
Play your way through the history of video games, drop some tokens in some pinball machines.
That's fantastic. So That's pretty much all I have for today. So I want to thank you for coming on to this podcast.
Yeah, absolutely. A lot of fun.
Absolutely. And I want to invite and encourage you to tell the fine folks the listeners to check out the Strong Museum, to check out you on social media, all of that good stuff. The floor is yours.
Sure. So museumplay.org is our website. It has tons of information about the museum and exhibits and all of the collections items that we've been talking about. We also have the National Toy Hall of Fame, which I had mentioned way earlier in the podcast, and the World Video Game Hall of Fame as well. So those are two programs that really let us tell that story to a bigger audience about these playthings and how they've shaped our lives. And you can also check us out on Facebook, Twitter, all of those fun things at Museum of Play.
Well, there you have it, folks. I want to again thank Shane Rhinewald from the Strong National Museum of Play in Rochester, New York. And I'm Rob Lee, saying that there is play in and around your neck of the woods. You just got to look for it.